This last week of this quarter, we're going to be talking about the skin and its appendages grouped together and called the integumentary system, as well as the urinary system or the excretory system. This makes up the first part. As I said, the first two parts are the integumentary system and the excretory system. Both of these are very important in maintaining homeostasis. Other systems, which we will talk about the first 2 weeks of next quarter, include the urinary system, the endocrine system, and the reproductive system. The skin has two basic functions. It's called, as I said before, the integumentary system, which is the skin and skin appendages, and I'll show you what I mean by skin appendages as we go through. The skin is responsible for communication with the outside world, particularly the outside world's communication with the body. There are sense receptors in the skin that inform the brain about the condition of the environment. And then, as I said, the integumentary system participates in the homeostasis by doing certain types of secretions which lead to cooling of the body and also the production of an oil to help prevent the skin from drying. And lastly, the skin is probably one of the most preventative or protective aspects of the body. It prevents the entry of harmful bacteria and chemicals into the body. And the importance of the skin here cannot be overemphasized. And we will also discuss that in the near future. So the layers of the skin, which were first described by Marcello Magpie, are the epidermis, and the epidermis goes from the top layer here down to what's called the basal layer, and the basal layer is what is actively dividing all the time. The skin is made up of squamous epithelial cells, and what you notice if you look at this diagram, as the skin cells travel up toward the surface, they become flatter and flatter. They become more oriented in a horizontal direction. And ultimately in this area is where they actually die. And what's on the top here are dead squamous epithelial cells. Now down here, what I've called the basal layer is also called, and these are actively dividing all the time. Now the buildup of epidermal cells is called a callus, and you get calluses where you get extensive wear and tear, and that occurs primarily on the hands and the feet. Psoriasis is a disease that's caused by an immune attack on the skin epithelial cells, and dandruff is something that occurs in some people, is when the epidermal cells of the scalp are sloughed off and flake off onto the clothing. Keratin is the important protein that is part of the skin epithelial cells. The epithelium is actually called keratinized epithelium because it has a significant amount of keratin, and this is a protein fiber that helps strengthen and harden the cells. Melanin, there are a few cells in the skin called melanocytes, and they produce a pigment called melanin, and this pigment protects from ultraviolet light damage which comes from the sun. And albinism is a disease that's caused by a lack of melanin. It's a genetic disease that's passed from person to person. So the epidermis, as we said before, is this part up here. Below the epidermis is the dermal layer, which is right here, and this is the layer beneath the epidermis, and it has a lot of loose connective tissue. It has muscles called erector pili, which we'll discuss in a minute, and sebaceous glands, as well as the hair follicle and the hair shaft that comes up, and nerve endings. Supports the epidermis and is important, and then this over here, by the way, is the sweat gland with the sweat duct. In the dermis is something called elastin, which allows the dermis to be flexible, as well as collagen fibers, which is the primary component of the dermal layer. Then below the dermal layer is what's known as the subcutaneous fat layer, This is primarily adipose tissue with loose connective tissue. When you hear people talking about subcutaneous injection, this is where the drug is deposited. Things like insulin are given by subcutaneous injection, and so it's a very shallow injection just into the third layer of the skin. Tanning is a natural process that occurs to protect the skin from UV light. So when a person is exposed to UV light, they're stimulated to produce, for their melanocytes, to produce more melanin, and that melanin acts to protect the skin from further damage by UV light. If a person gets too much UV light, then they can have a painful inflammation known as sunburn. The other problem with exposure to UV light is skin cancer. And skin cancer, by and large, comes from exposure to UV light. Now, different people have different sensitivities based on their complexion. For example, African American individuals, because they have a large amount of melanin, it's very, very rare for them to develop skin cancer. Orientals or Asian people are kind of intermediate in terms of their exposure to UV light and their protection, as well as Indians from India. And then, Caucasians can actually be divided across a various spectrum, from people who almost never get sunburned to people that get sunburned quite easily and are very sensitive. So there are several types of skin cancer. The first and most common by far is the basal cell carcinoma. This is a cancer of the basal cell, which is in the basal layer of the epidermis, and is completely dependent on sun exposure in order for this to develop. Then there are the squamous cell carcinomas, which are also cancers of the same epithelial cells. However, while these are limited to the germinal layer or the basal layer, these can be cells that are not part of that layer. And then the last one is the one that people know a lot about, which is malignant melanoma. And these are cancers that come from the melanocytes that are in the skin. And by far, the malignant melanoma is the most dangerous, and the basal cell carcinoma is the least dangerous, and then squamous cell cancer is somewhere in between. The hair, and this is a diagram of the hair within the dermis, resides in the dermal layer in terms of all of its mechanism. And the hair follicle, which is right along here, is where the hair grows. And the hair shaft is this central object in the middle of the hair follicle that sticks up out of the skin. And the purpose of the hair is homeostasis. In other words, the hair acts as part of the mechanism to keep the body warm, and also increases the sensitivity to touch. In other words, when the hair is disturbed, there are nerve endings that detect that disturbance, and it increases the sensitivity to touch. Now, this muscle right here is called the erector pili, and the erector pili responds to cold, and what it does is when it contracts, it causes the hair to stand up. And when you see that, it helps people it's what we call goose flesh or goose pimples, and it helps keep the person warm. The sebaceous glands are glands that are associated with the hair follicle and produce semen. And let me show you that on this last. These are the sebaceous glands here and here. And sebum is an oral oil product that waterproofs the skin and keeps it soft and flexible. Now, blackheads occur when the hair follicle is plugged and dirt and oil become trapped in the hair follicle. The other thing that happens is shown right here, which is the pimple, which can become more serious and turn into a boil. But what essentially happens is you have a normal hair follicle over here with the sebaceous glands on the side. They produce oil, keep the skin soft and flexible. The hair is just fine, and then for whatever reason, this becomes plugged in some way and inflamed. And once it's plugged and inflamed, then this sebum becomes, while it's still being produced, becomes trapped. And then when it becomes trapped, and bacteria from the skin surface get into this sebum, and then it becomes infected and inflamed, and then it forms pus with white cells and other things, debris from the white cells, and ultimately this will rupture into the dermis and cause what we call a pimple. And these pimples can have a sort of a lid on them, so what you just see is a red raised bump, or they can become what we call a whitehead. And both are frequently helped if you can relieve the pressure and remove the pus. Now, the body temperature is regulated by the skin through the production of sweat, which cools the body. Although uncommon, dehydration can occur with excessive sweating and a failure to take in enough fluids, which happens, for example, when you run long distances in the summer. And if you have a significant loss of intravascular volume, it causes dehydration. Now, the openings in the skin that release the sweat are called pores. Not actually shown very well in this diagram, but you can see this is the sweat duct going up, and it ultimately comes out up here and releases the sweat onto the surface of the skin. And then it's the evaporation of the sweat that cools the body. Now, the area that controls body temperature is the hypothalamus. That is the part of the brain that's responsible for controlling when we sweat, when we don't sweat, etc. And it's an autonomic function. It's not something that you can control. Now, I told you that the protective function of the skin was its most important function, and it's one of the most important functions throughout the body. And the major insult of the skin is a body burn. And a third-degree burn is when the full thickness of the skin is damaged by the burn or thermal damage. And this can lead to infection and death. And the risk of death is directly related to the percentage of skin that's burned. A 50% body burn, for example, if both your legs were to be burned significantly, that would be approximately a 50% body burn. That has a 40 to 50% mortality rate. Second-degree burns, and first-degree burns for that matter, are nowhere near as dangerous. This is thermal damage that's limited to the dermis and above, whereas a first-degree burn is limited to the epidermis. This can cause blistering, but there's no full thickness, so the integrity of the skin is maintained and the infection risk is significantly less. Now we're going to shift and begin talking about the urinary tract system. The urinary tract system is responsible for excretion, and excretion is the removal of liquid waste substances. The urinary system is shown primarily here, and it's the major part of the excretory system. And urine is a liquid waste form that is formed by the kidneys and expelled through the urinary tract system. Kidneys are responsible for filtering the blood and removing waste and excess water. And once the urine is formed by the kidneys, it passes into the ureters, shown here, down to the urinary bladder, which is a storage organ for urine. It allows us to go periods of time without having to use the bathroom, and then through the urethra out the body. How do the kidneys work? The functional unit of the kidney is called a nephron. And this is just part of a nephron right here. This is what's known as a glomerulus. This part right here is a glomerulus. And the glomerulus is sort of the business filtering part of the kidney. And it is a sieve-like structure that filters the blood into a space called Bowman's capsule, which is this space right here and right here. Actually, this is actually called Bowman's space, and Bowman's capsule is this whole structure right here. And then the urine, once it's filtered here, it goes into this tube right here, which is called a renal tubule. And once the filtered fluid is taken out of Bowman's space, it goes in to the renal tubule, and then The function of the renal tubule is to reabsorb multiple substances in fluid. And this is the entirety of the nephron. Bowman's capsule is up here and the glomerulus is up here. And then what happens, this part is the glomerulus right here. And what happens is that it's filtered here and then it goes into the tubule. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. Then this is called the loop of Henle, which goes down and back up, and then the distal convoluted tubule, and then into the collecting duct. And reabsorption of water and soluble substances occurs in this area here. And this sets up what's called a countercurrent exchange. The osmolarity at the bottom of this is approximately 1200. The osmolarity here is approximately 300, and the purpose of that exchange is to suck water out of this system. Once it goes through all that, the fluid that remains is called urine, and the urine is then transported here into the collecting system and into the renal pelvis, and then from the renal pelvis into the ureter. So the urine is filtered here, goes through the reabsorption process, ends up ultimately in the collecting system here, and then in the renal pelvis. Once it's in the renal pelvis, it goes into the ureter and down to the bladder. Unfiltered blood comes in through the arteries. Filtered blood is removed by the veins. Now, the kidneys are responsible for regulating certain things above and beyond the excretion that they do. And one of the most important things that the kidneys do is they produce renin. And renin is a hormone that the kidneys release in response to low blood pressure. The kidneys are extremely critical in the control of blood pressure in the body. Renin, once released, also has an impact on the excretion of antidiuretic hormone, which we will talk about, I believe, the first week in the fourth quarter when we talk about the endocrine system. Antidiuretic hormone is responsible for the increased absorption of water or reabsorption of water in the renal tubule. And its name tells you what it does. It decreases the volume of urine. It's an antidiuretic. It decreases the volume of urine by increasing the reabsorption of water in the kidney. So this is how it works. This stands for the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. When that increases, it impacts the step one is it hits the kidney. The kidney produces renin. Renin acts on a compound that's made by the liver called angiotensinogen. Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Then the lung produces something called angiotensin converting enzyme, which causes the production of angiotensin 2. And angiotensin is essentially a compound that raises blood pressure. The other thing that happens is there's an increase in the production of aldosterone, and aldosterone is a hormone that's important for salt and water reabsorption. And when aldosterone is increased, then the water is more absorbed. When aldosterone is decreased, then water is less reabsorbed along with minerals. And then, as we said before, ADH is also responsible for reabsorption. If you have decreased ADH, then there's more urine or a diuresis occur. Now, when a person's kidneys don't work anymore, they do not do what they're supposed to do, that is, they don't control fluid and they don't take care of the abnormal chemicals, then basically they have kidney failure and they have a need for artificial kidney or what we call dialysis. And dialysis can actually be done two ways. One is by machine through the blood, which is shown. This is a dialysis machine that dialyzes people via the machine, but they can also be dialyzed through the peritoneum. You put fluid in the peritoneum and an exchange of water and chemicals occurs, and then you drain that, and that acts to remove toxins from the blood as well. And so the dialysis machine filters the blood, or in peritoneal dialysis, the peritoneal cavity removes the toxins. We'll finish up with some ways that the kidneys can get damaged, and alcohol is a culprit yet again. Alcohol has many impacts. One of its impacts is to depress ADH. And this is why people who drink alcohol, in addition to the volume of what they're drinking, because of the decrease in ADH, they have an increased diuresis. Caffeine has a similar diuretic effect on the kidneys, and nicotine actually stimulates ADH. Nicotine can come from tobacco, for example, and leads to a decrease in urine production. Kidney stones occur when the urine composition and volume reaches a critical concentration and allows for the formation of crystals. It's one of the more painful experiences that people can have when they're past a kidney stone. And then gout is a specific crystal that forms that if the uric acid is not proper, uric acid, I don't know if you remember, but I said uric acid was a byproduct of protein metabolism. If that's not properly removed through the kidneys, then crystals form. These crystals can form stones in the kidney, but also can form stones or crystals in the joints. This leads to a serious inflammation, which causes what's called gouty arthritis or podagra. And then lastly, obviously infections can occur, and a urinary tract infection is basically an infection that affects the bladder. Pyelonephritis is when that infection goes up the ureters and infects the kidney.